Hello everyone, this is Henny Espinosa, VP for Just Wish Foundation. This is a story of a mother's love for her son and how losing him in the most senseless way has turned her into a warrior with a mission to get unwanted guns off the streets.
Patty, thank you so much for joining us here in Just Wish Foundation. We are so inspired by your story of how you've turned something so tragic into an opportunity to really make a difference in the community. You've been at the forefront, of putting an end to gun violence, but take us back to that moment, because this is personal for you. This mission is personal for you. Take us back to 2014 when something so terrible happened to your son.
Thank you for inviting me for this. And it's hard to, I think it helps to say that I was a longtime journalist. So for so many years, I was the editor running stories and writing headlines about gun shootings and gun deaths. And because it's so personal, I never imagined what happens after that headline runs, what happens to the family. And I never thought that our family would be, the subject of one of those stories. And so it was September 21st, 2014. And actually I was engaged at the time, and we were looking for a place to get married, in Napa, because both my son Robby and my daughter Julie were saying, oh, you've been with him for so long now, it's time to get married. And so we were actually looking for a place to get married. And so it turned out to be really a beautiful morning, a beautiful day. And I remember texting my son saying, oh, we found the place, and he was so excited. And by the time we got home, it was about 4:00 in the afternoon. And I knew my son was getting ready to work the next morning. So I told him to come by the house to pick up some food, like Filipinos, yerbaon, for lunch tomorrow. And he said, yeah, okay, mom, and it was less than an hour later that I got a call that he was shot. And I always tell this story starting with the morning when we were looking for a place to get married, because that really is how quickly gun violence can change your life. Literally within the span of 10 hours, we went from planning our wedding, the most lovely day, to thinking about planning a funeral. And that's the tragedy of gun violence. It's so easy to get a gun. It's so easy to pull a trigger, and yet it changes those lives of both the perpetrators and the victim forever. And so that was that day for us.
So there were no signs, nothing, no warnings at all that this would happen to your son?
No, I mean, there rarely are signs. He wasn't a gang member. He was never in trouble with the law. It was a bungled burglary. He was with his aunt who was visiting, and there was an attempted burglary, and it just always happened. Not always, but it happens a lot. Wrong place, wrong time, and so that's how this happened.
Were you able to come to terms, or were you even able to really fully understand kind of why my son, and who are you going to hold accountable for such a senseless crime?
Well, I mean, that's it's difficult enough losing a child, it's difficult enough losing a child to such tragic circumstances. But what a lot of people don't understand is when it is a homicide, there is an added layer of grief and frustration and hopelessness, because we live in a correctional system where it's not streamlined. It took years until we got a court date, and we would get a court date and then a new court date and then a new court date, and it was constantly rescheduled. And every single time there was a court date, we would have to relive the trauma. We would have to mentally try to prepare to hear the details of how he was killed, and then only to be told, oh, it's canceled for a few more months, and so this was ongoing for about 2 years until we finally sat in court. And then you have to be traumatized with listening to the details of what happened, because honestly, I never ever read the police report. I couldn't think of how that could help me, and everyone is different. Some people, they want to know exactly what happened. Everyone's different. And that's something that I think we need to talk about too as a society is pain and trauma, PTSD, grief. These aren't things that we are comfortable speaking about. It took 2 years, I would say, for me to feel I didn't go back to the city of Vallejo where he was killed, even though I had lived there since I was in 3rd grade. We would go take an extra hour just so we wouldn't have to pass the freeway that we had to drive to go to the crime scene. And it wasn't until I wrote a book. And toward the end of the book, I came to this epiphany that, of course, the reason I can't go back to Vallejo is because the memories of going there to learn that my child was killed is in my mind. But if I change the narrative, if I create a foundation where really the goal to go to the city now is to help make it better, then that will empower me to go back. And that was the only time I went back, when I had already set up a foundation for my son, and my mission was really clear in my mind that I'm going to try to make a difference in my son's name, because I didn't want people to Google Robby Poblete and just see gun violence victim. I wanted them to Google him and look at the number of lives that were changed because of what happened.
You wanted to do this in his honor.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's talk about, before the tragedy, what Robby was like, what he like as a person, what were his hopes and dreams?
He was only 23. I say only 23, but he's also a young man now, and that was I think the hardest thing to grapple with, is that he was just on the cusp of becoming who he was going to be, and that part is hard. And so before he was killed, he was working at Genentech, and he was welding, and he was collecting a lot of scrap metal to create art. He worked on both sides of his mind. He was both with a scientific mind, but also artistic mind. So he was learning how to weld, and this goes into why our foundation is set up the way it is. But one of the most interesting things I found out about him when he passed, because I just kept sleeping in his room, there was a large stack of books on his nightstand, and there was the Bible, there was the Quran, there was a book about Buddhism. He was a seeker, and he was really on a spiritual journey, and not judging any one culture or belief, but taking all of it in and trying to understand, what is the common denominator of religion? And that's love, that's forgiveness, that's empathy. And so when you when you have a tragedy like this, a lot of people cannot recover, and I don't blame them. It's your heart is ripped out, but I do believe that tragedies like this happen because people perpetuate that pain. Mm-hmm. They don't know what to do with it, so they perpetuate it. That's the only way they know how. But when I saw those books on these different religious faiths, I wanted to make sure that I transformed that pain into something filled with purpose, because my daughter had already lost her brother, and I didn't want her to lose her mother. Mm-hmm. And I also didn't want to spend the rest of my life filled with vengeance and hate. Mm-hmm. And so that really helped me. He actually became my teacher after he passed away, because I was following kind of in his footsteps, becoming a seeker.
Mm-hmm. Patty, let's talk about accountability in his death. Where are we now in terms of finding justice in that regard?
It took years. There were arrests made. We went through the trial. Two young men were found guilty. They're now serving their time. There were other people involved who aren't serving that much time. There were 3 people, arrested who are serving time. So yeah, that happened. It's hard though, because a lot of people say, they were celebrating that, that, oh, now you have closure. And it really is not that simple. It's not that, okay, they're found guilty, they're in jail, I feel so much better. Mm-hmm. It's not, the closure is me dying first and my son moving on. That's closure for a parent, to make sure that they can die knowing that their child they have their own families now, and your grandchildren are there. So that wasn't closure to me. It was actually painful to see young men now who I know are going to be in jail for so long. And I also think about their own mothers. How did their mothers feel? Mm-hmm. So it really just it changes you. I think tragedy changes you, and you become much more empathetic to other people's pain. But that was not a moment of celebration for me.
Part of your healing and part of kind of understanding this, the cycle of violence is, of course, your work in the foundation. So tell us about the goals, tell us about the mission and the programs that you have for the Robby Poblete Foundation.
And as I was describing Robby, I was saying that this will explain why the foundation was set up the way it was, right? So number one is the gun buyback program. And obviously my son was killed by gun violence, but specifically he was killed by a gun that was obtained illegally. And after it was used to take my son's life, it was resold on the streets where it was used to commit another crime. And so I really want to emphasize that point, because one stolen gun can be used to commit numerous crimes and impact numerous lives. So when I have a gun buyback and people tell me it's ineffective, that's not going to do anything. I mean, honestly, even taking one gun out of circulation, you can never quantify how many lives you've saved by doing that. But I do know that once that gun is surrendered, the probability of that gun taking someone's life drops to zero. I know that, for a fact. And so that's why we have the gun buyback. But then what I thought of, because again, my son was learning how to weld, he was collecting metal, he was wanting to create art. I started to ask, what happens to the guns after they're collected? So the law enforcement agency goes through the serial numbers. They make sure that it wasn't reported in a crime or reported stolen. And I asked, well, can we have possession of those guns and dismantle them and give them in the hands of artists to transform the guns into art? And that was something that had never been asked before, to these particular law enforcement partners. And we got a contract. So not only do we get the metal from the guns from our own gun buybacks, we get guns that have been confiscated and adjudicated beyond California. And so we have thousands and thousands of guns, in our inventory that are being turned into art, which brings us to our next program, which is called Art of Peace. So Art of Peace is when we engage artists in the communities where we took the guns from, and they turn those pieces of guns into these beautiful sculptures. And once those are completed, we get the community together, we have an art exhibit, and we use that as a vehicle to talk about the impacts of gun violence. And I remember thinking, gosh, I don't know if this is just a vanity project because this is what Robby wanted to do. What impact is this really going to make? But I've been so shocked that this is actually one of the most emotionally powerful programs. There are always tears. There are always mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, husbands, wives of people who have been killed by gun violence who show up. And it's always so powerful, because you look at these like a beautiful butterfly or a tree, and you have no idea that these were once guns that were created to take people's lives. And now they're a beautiful sculpture that's meant to educate and inspire. So we've had numerous exhibits. We had in Vallejo, in Oakland, in San Francisco, in Georgia, numerous places. And then our third program is really geared toward, I was thinking of the young men who were arrested in my son's homicide. If someone had just given them the opportunity, if they had just learned a skill, if they had just made a living wage, of course they wouldn't have chosen this life, because no one is born and grows up thinking, I want to go to jail when I grow up, And so I thought of this third program, which is our vocational program, and we work with members of the reentry population, former substance abuse survivors, homeless, formerly homeless people, and we pay for their boots, their books, their tools to get them into these apprenticeships, and we follow them all the way until they get a job. And so that has also been very, very rewarding. We've given away more, I think like $40,000 worth of apprenticeship scholarships. So as you can see, each program is very connected to Robby's DNA, who he was at the time he was taken.
Your work has really gotten a lot of attention from the community. Even the state has awarded you guys, is it the best nonprofit in this state? How do you feel that your hard work, has gotten recognized, and hopefully this paves the way for more support for your foundation?
One of the first things I did was to identify kind of like a dream team in the community, because I knew that I wouldn't get anywhere unless I got community buy-in. And the first community I wanted to impact was the city where my son was killed. So I identified our congressman at the federal level. I identified our state senator, our state assemblyman. I put the mayor on there. I put law enforcement. I put the DA, and then I put the art community. These are factions of the community that rarely would come together in one room, right? And so for me to get them, and I sent these emails, probably 75% of them didn't know who I was. And I sent this email saying, my son was killed in the streets of Vallejo in broad daylight. And I just explained the story. I would like to get you into the room because I want to make an impact in this community. I thought maybe 5 of them would show up. Every single person on that list showed up. We had a long table. I had every single person that I invited show up to that table. And so for me to be able to say, this is what happened in your community, you have an opportunity now to work with me to affect change. And I'm going to do it whether you're in it or not, so you could be part of it or you can get left behind. Every single person bought into that. So that was number 1. And then we started gaining traction. The people who didn't want to help, of course, they didn't understand the concept of a gun buyback. It's a very political issue when you talk about guns. It's either you love guns and there's nothing to say about it, or you detest guns and you want it, done with. And I think on both sides, you need empathy, right? So for the people who love their guns and we just cast them off as conservative nut jobs, that's a mistake. I think that's a huge mistake. They were raised with a mentality that they have to protect themselves, and that's born of fear. So you have to understand that. And when you speak to that, you have to have empathy on that side. Mm-hmm. On their side, they think we're these just progressive who want to take all their guns away. And they don't get the nuances of the fact that a gun buyback is a voluntary program. I get death threats every single time I post that we're having a gun buyback. And I don't understand that, because I'm not telling you that you have to bring your guns. I'm telling you, if you are a responsible gun owner and you no longer want extra guns in your house that are susceptible to theft, then please responsibly, bring them to our gun buyback. We will dismantle them and we'll do what we do with them, And so this notion of it's 0 to 100 needs to be addressed, because people these days don't understand. They don't lead with empathy. They don't try to understand the other side. So then you have what we result in, right? And I think that's where the art program is really powerful, because when you talk about gun violence just as a political issue, there's no moving the needle. But when you use art to talk about it, it becomes a human issue. Mm-hmm. And my whole thing is, if once you change the heart, you have the opportunity to change the mind. Mm-hmm. And that's where we have been so powerful. And so the fact that we were named the California's top nonprofit in 2018 was, that's all for Robby. I can only do what I do because of him. And I wish I didn't have to. Every success comes with a reminder that I'm only here because he's not. Mm-hmm. And that's very difficult, but it also gives me pride that his name is on all of this. So yeah, that's a good thing.
I was reading that you wrote a lot of letters to Robby, after his death, and every day you would write something to him. If you had a message, if you had a letter to write to Robby now, what would you tell your son?
Oh, that's hard. People have asked me that before and I just declined to answer because it's so hard. I wrote a letter to him every single day for 1 year, and I stopped because I'm never going to have an answer. Every letter ended with questions, and I'm never going to have an answer to any of those questions. And so that's why I stopped. And, the nonprofit was the answer to those questions. Why did you have to go? He didn't have to, and so through everything in our foundation, we are creating ways so that blessed mothers end up the way I have ended up. Blessed sons end up the way Robby has ended up, and if I could write a letter to him now, I never answer this question because it's so hard. It's just, I hope you're proud of what your mom is doing for you. You know, I think my biggest, the proudest thing I've done is to give birth to him and his daughter. And I think that's what I want my legacy to be, is to be Robby's mom, you know, and even after he was gone, I continued to live in his honor every single day.
Thank you so much, Patty. Thank you for your story that just is heartbreaking and heartwarming and inspiring at the same time. And I'm so proud of seeing what you do for the community. And I hope that your story and your work in the community just inspires other people to do the same for their own communities. And Mr. Jaku and Just Wish Foundation and myself, we just want to express support for you and what you want to do moving forward. Even with the pandemic, there's even more need right now, and we just support you in any way that we can. And I hope that the rest of the world hears your story and puts an end to senseless crimes and gun violence. So more power to you, Patty.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.